One of the challenges, I think, for the kind of research that was presented this morning by Stéphanie and her collaborators is that art scholars outside of the sciences, art scholars in philosophy, but more so in the humanities, will find it difficult to connect those results to what they think is important in art studies and what they think is critically important, important to our critical practices. And I'd like to say something that I think will provide some context and maybe a theoretical framework for the work that was presented this morning that will help to bridge that gap. I'm hoping it will help to bridge that gap a little bit. And the way I'm going to do that is by discussing a view that David kind of set aside. He said it was controversial. I'll encapsulate it through what I'll call the experiential thesis. Aesthetic properties are characteristically represented in sensory experiences. And I'm going to try to use this thesis to provide some of this framework to bridge the gap between the humanities and the scientific research that we discussed this morning. But first, just some examples to give you a taste of what I have in mind here. So you're walking across British Columbia, where I live, and the sun comes down close to the horizon, and you see the glory of the sunset. You see it to be glorious. You see it as glory. Vision represents the glory, right? Or you go to a dance performance and you see the dancers vigorously moving on stage. You hear the music. You see the energy. You hear the dynamism. These are represented in visual and auditory experiences. Or you decide to knock off after today and have a glass of champagne. And you taste the balance. Your tongue represents the balance of the wine to you. Okay, so those are just three examples to give you an idea of what I have in mind. Here are a couple of assumptions to focus in a little bit further, and they will provide you some context. You'll see some echoes of some things that David said, especially. I'm going to assume what you could call aesthetic cognitivism. This is the idea that aesthetic properties are represented in the mind. Why say that? Well, there's another view. Some people might say when you taste the wine, you taste lemoniness, and you taste that hint of brioche, and you like it. And when you say you like it, you say it's balanced. But all that's really there is the lemoniness and the toastiness and your liking, your affect. That's all that's there. I want to say, no, the balance is something that you taste in addition. So you taste the lemoniness, and you taste the toastiness, and you taste the balance. That's what this says, okay? Not just the liking. Secondly, I'm going to draw a distinction between aesthetic properties and values and responses and artistic properties and values and responses. And you'll notice that the examples that I gave were not just about art. The dance was art, but the champagne is not art, and the sunset is certainly not art. So the aesthetic is much broader than the artistic. You might think that artistic properties are the kind of achievement properties that David was talking about. And so I'm saying, let's set aside this achievement business. It's very social and conventional and complex. And let's just think about what's going on in our mind in aesthetic response, which I don't think is quite so freighted with the social. You'll ask me, OK, what exactly are aesthetic properties? Unfortunately, scandalously, I don't have a theory of aesthetic properties. Nobody does. But we have some good paradigm cases that are enough to give us a conception. Frank Sibley, the English philosopher who worked in the United States during the 1960s, gave us a list. And I think this list is a good set of paradigm cases. So being unified, integrated, lifeless, serene, somber, dynamic, powerful, vivid, delicate, moving, trite, sentimental, and tragic. These are words that appear in criticism. They seem to be important, and we use them to express those likings that we have. So it seems wrong to say that we taste the wine and then we like it and that's the end of the story. We like it for reasons, and those reasons attribute those kinds of aesthetic properties. That's the idea here. And we also like it for artistic reasons, but I'm setting that aside. A lot of contemporary philosophers use the words aesthetic and artistic interchangeably, and I'm saying let's not do that. Okay, how do these assumptions bear on the findings that Stéphanie and her colleagues have made? Well, they find that there's an effect on liking, and that is a methodological strategy that they talk about liking, because that's something that's measurable on that 9-point Likert scale. What does it stand for? Actually, I think they're open on that. So Stéphanie said earlier on that it's really hard to get a sense of what the aesthetic is in these experiments, and of course we're trying to work towards that. And I'm saying, well, this conception of the aesthetic in terms of these paradigm properties, that's consistent with the operational conception of the aesthetic in terms of liking. Maybe the liking will get eventually explained in these more specific terms. And this liking is determined by the perception of artistic gestures. That's the other thing that they found, and I think that this is something that's really interesting, because it means that it broadens the possibilities for the sensory representation of aesthetic properties. At the same time, I think that these findings that Stéphanie presented pose a challenge to the experiential thesis. But that's a good thing, because it could be that refining the thesis, getting a better idea of what the thesis really says, can give us a richer framework for understanding research that might follow up on the work that we heard about this morning, or at least indicate how we can interpret the results, the language to use in interpreting the results. And that's what I'm going to suggest. So the challenge, first, another challenge. This is a familiar challenge to the experiential thesis. Experiential thesis says aesthetic properties are represented and characteristically represented in sensory experiences. Well, here's a critic talking about Spencer's epithalamion, says it's an elegant symmetry and an intricate harmony. Now, those are paradigm aesthetic properties. They're attributed to works that are not objects of sense perception. Yes, it's true you can read the words on the page, and so there's a kind of a sensory vehicle for your access to the work. But the elegant symmetry and the intricate harmony aren't there in your visual experience of the words on the page. They're in your experience of the images in the poem, the storyline of the poem. Or here's John Bailey, the Oxford professor of literature, describing Patrick O'Brien's The Reverse of the Medal. Light as bubbles at the brim, stimulating tender. Paradigm aesthetic vocabulary. Again, literature. Here's another example. You all have seen this before. It's said to be ingenious and cheeky by Peter Goldie, a philosopher. And the thing is that what's ingenious and cheeky is not the three-dimensional object purchased in the plumbing store that you see with your eyes. What is ingenious and cheeky is something else, something that Duchamp did that you don't see with your eyes. Okay, so that's the familiar challenge to the experiential thesis. The challenge says, look, some aesthetic properties are not represented in any sensory experience at all. So why do you think the experience thesis is true? One option here, and it's an option that some philosophers have taken, is to throw in the towel, give up, and say, OK, you know what? Literary works and works of conceptual art don't have aesthetic properties, but that's OK, because they have artistic properties. This is David and Greg and a bunch of philosophers really like this view. Well, I'm not sure about literature. But another option is to see if we can look for a broader notion of experience. It's a little bit broader than sensory experience narrowly conceived. Okay? And this is where works that we access through multiple modalities might come in handy. They also, I think, ask us to think about the experience through which we attribute aesthetic properties in a broader way. So let me give you some examples. First, there are explicitly multimodal aesthetic experiences. So you see the dynamism of the dance and you hear it. Audio-visual, two modalities. But this is something you're consciously aware of. It's something you're aware of both of these modalities realizing the aesthetic properties. Likewise, in La Traviata, you hear and you see the sadness of the story that's being narrated. Right? So those are explicitly multimodal aesthetic experiences. Here's another one. This is what David was referring to earlier on. It turns out that maybe you think you're listening to this string quartet and you hear it as rolling, having a rolling character. That's aesthetic. A rolling character turns out to be very much a result of seeing the gestures of the musicians. Or if you hear Eric Clapton's guitar solo as contemplative, that's largely a result of your seeing the way he plays his guitar. So this is a very surprising finding. The visual channel actually dominates the auditory channel. It's amazing. You wouldn't expect that. So that's implicit, because it's surprising that there's other channels playing a role. And that's what we see in these cases where perception of the motor actions of the artist affects liking, or seems to have an aesthetic knock-on effect, as in cases like this. It's not apparent to us. Our experience itself doesn't represent to us that the motor actions of the artist are feeding into our experience of the calmness of the Pointilliste painting, or the thoughtfulness of the Chinese painting, or whatever it is, right? Yolanda can tell us what the right word is to use there. Just so that we can be clear that the issue here isn't about vision versus motor systems interacting. You can have explicitly multimodal visual experiences that also have a kinetic motor element. So this is Scott Snibby's Deep Space, an interactive artwork where the two-dimensional visual display is determined partly by your own motions. And I think there you have a combined visual and auditory experience that's responsible for your thinking of the work as jazzy or electric or whatever aesthetic property you might want to attribute to it. And here's a French example, Bernard Lassus. He's a rest stop on the A45 in the south of France. It's got, I'll just have to explain this to you very briefly. At the end of the alley is a framed Roman artifact. And you can go to this tower next to the highway. Have any of you been there? You go to the tower, climb up into the tower. There's the tower in the upper left. And in the tower, there's a maquette of the artifact. And what you're supposed to do is look at the Roman artifact and touch the maquette at the same time. So you have the visual and the motor tactile experience simultaneously, explicitly multimodal. I think there's a difference between these cases and the painting cases, right? So there's a difference between the implicit cases and the explicit cases. OK, so what's the new challenge to the experience thesis that we get from the work that was presented this morning? Well, the new challenge is this. Just assume that sensory qualities are qualities of things that are shared by sensory duplicates, phenomenal duplicates rather. So what does that mean? Well, a phenomenal duplicate is if you have a couple of items and you can't tell them apart without spatiotemporal information. They look exactly the same, so the only way you can individuate them is by putting them in different places or in different times. Imagine two perfect silver balls. You can't tell them apart except by knowing where they are or when they are where they are. Those are phenomenal duplicates. And the qualities that are shared by phenomenal duplicates, we can call those sensory qualities. So in the case of vision, the sensory qualities of vision will be color and shape and even texture. And in the case of hearing, the sensory qualities will be pitch and timbre and rhythm and qualities like this. So sensory qualities are qualities shared by phenomenal duplicates. Jesse Prince, he doesn't endorse this argument, but he finds it to be a very common argument in a lot of contemporary philosophy. And I think that it has a pretty strong intuitive appeal. The argument goes like this. What's a sensory experience? So the experience thesis says aesthetic properties are represented in sensory experiences. Well, what are sensory experiences? How broad or narrow should they be? Do they include our engagement with Duchamp's fountain? Do they include literature? Do they include these implicitly multimodal, motor elements of these implicitly multimodal works? So what's a sensory experience? Well, the conclusion of the argument is that a sensory experience only represents sensory qualities. Why is that? Because sensory experiences only represent what makes it phenomenal difference, an introspectable difference, what makes a difference to the way things appear to us. And only sensory qualities make a phenomenal difference. That's basically the definition of a sensory quality that I just gave you. So sensory experiences only represent sensory qualities. So this is a narrow conception of sensory experience. It says that sensory experiences are just the experiences which show how things look, and they can't distinguish among sensory duplicates. If that's right, then artist gestures are not represented in sensory experiences of paintings. You can't tell the painting made by the gesture from a painting faked to make it look as if it's made by that gesture. You have an issue with duplicates here. Of course, we can infer from the visible traces that artist gestures leave on surfaces that they might have made a certain gesture. This is exactly David's view about access. It's epistemic. Okay, so this is all that we're left with. David is right. And if that's right, then the aesthetic properties that are realized through the movements of the artist's hand in making a brushstroke are not represented in sensory experiences either. So E.T. will turn out to be false for these works. So I'm going to suggest that 3 is false. We have no reason to believe 3, this narrow conception of sensory experience, because 1 is false. It's not true that sensory experiences only represent what makes a phenomenal difference. We can have a broader conception of sensory experience. So how does that go? Well, here's a kind of a standard picture at a very high level of abstraction of what goes on in us cognitively. So there's the world, and it contains trees, for instance. And we have, the world is full of physical magnitudes, like light. And we have sensory transducers, like eyeballs, retinas. And the sensory transducers pick up on the physical magnitudes. And they send information to a kind of a representational system. We call it sensory experience. And then sensory experience gives us input for forming judgments or beliefs, like the tree is gray. So that's a common, standard, very, very simple boxology. Now, sensory experiences do represent sensory qualities. They represent the qualities that are shared by phenomenal duplicates. They do. That's one thing that they do represent. But it's possible to say that they represent more than that. It's possible to say that they represent anything that they carry information about. Okay? So if there's a reliable correlation between a feature in the world and the feature of the sensory experience, then the sensory experience carries information about that feature in the world, and that feature in the world need not be a sensory quality. It could be something else. So let me give you a very simple example. Raise your hand if you like art. Take a look around. Keep your hands up. Take a look around. OK, now, when you raised that little action there, established a reliable correlation between a sensory quality, right, a kind of a shape sticking up in your visual field, and a property of people in the world being the kind of person who likes art. It established a reliable correlation. So when you looked around and you saw the hands raised, you might say, you see the property being a person who likes art. That's not a sensory quality, right? Sensory duplicates don't share that quality. But you can see that quality because all you need is a reliable correlation. So this is what we could say about the wine example. I don't want to put a picture of a tongue, so the eye is the tongue. Tongues are too gross. So you taste. There's the glass of wine. There's some aromatic molecules that are detected by your tongue. And sensory experience represents a taste as lemony and as toasty. And at the same time, it reliably carries information that the wine is balanced. The representation of the toastiness and the lemoniness reliably carries information that the wine is balanced. So you can have a sensory experience that carries the information that the wine is balanced. The sensory experience represents that the wine is balanced. And on that basis, you can form a judgment that it's balanced. So this seems really easy to broaden the contents of sensory experience this way. It turns out sensory experience can represent aesthetic qualities like being balanced, but also personal qualities like being the kind of person who likes art. Problem is, it's too broad. It's way too broad. There's a difference between putting the wine in your mouth, swishing it around, and tasting it to be balanced, and listening to a wine critic. This is Jancis Robinson, the English wine critic. And she could be sitting there saying to you, you know what, this wine is balanced. Okay, now you're having an auditory experience of her saying this wine is balanced. She's a good wine critic. So your auditory experience reliably carries information that the wine is balanced. So your auditory experience represents that the wine is balanced, which is fine, except it doesn't represent the wine's being balanced in the same way as tasting the wine does. There's a difference. It's one thing to have a sensory experience representing the wine as balanced by representing the taste of the wine, the lemoniness and the toastiness. And it's a completely different thing to have an auditory experience that represents the wine as balanced because you're hearing somebody say the wine is balanced. There's a difference there, and it's a difference we care about. And the spirit of the experience thesis to take seriously the spirit of the experience thesis, we have to characterize this difference. There are philosophers who are interested in the perception of moral properties. I meant to put a picture in here, but you can imagine I had a cartoon of two boys in a schoolyard, and one is bullying the other, kind of going like this, right? And there are some philosophers who say your visual experience of the one boy doing that to the other represents a bad thing happening, or represents a wrong, or represents cruelty, represents the property of being cruel. And so what they say is there's a relation that obtains between the actions that you see and the being cruel. The actions that you see are B, and the being cruel, that's F, such that anybody who perceives being B, I'm having trouble here, anyone who perceives being B thereby perceives being cruel. Anyone who perceives that bullying perceives being cruel. There's a specific relation. It's a relation that's stronger than reliable, non-accidental correlation. Andrew Cullison, American philosopher, says, Robert Audi calls it the relation of being consequent on, or a grounding relation. But we don't need to understand exactly what the nature of that relation is. All we need to is the idea that it's stronger than reliable correlation. So there's a difference then between the tasting the wine and hearing the wine critic, because when you taste the wine, you're tasting the balance and what makes it balanced, the lemoniness and the toastiness. Whereas when you listen to the wine critic, your sensory experience may represent the balance, but it doesn't represent what makes the wine balanced. It's not Jancis Robinson saying it's balanced that makes it balanced. It's the lemoniness and toastiness that makes it balanced. Okay, so what we need is we need a more complex picture of how information is being carried from the world to sensory experience to judgment. We need a more complex picture. And I'm going to reach back to an old idea of Fred Dretski's, American philosopher Fred Dretski. He died last year, and I started to reread some of his work that was very influential for me when I was younger. And I realized that this could be helpful. So he distinguishes between analog and digital encodings of signals that carry information. This is a little technical, but I'll do my best. His analog-digital distinction is different from everybody else's. So don't think unless you've read Dretske, you probably don't quite have the same idea as he has in mind. So a signal carries some information in digital form, just in case it carries no more information about the source, unless that information is analytically or normically nested in the sources having that property. I'll give you an example in a moment. Whereas the signal carries information in analog form if the information is contingently, that means non-analytically and non-normically nested in the base information. So his example is the cup has coffee in it, and a picture of a cup. So there's an inscription on the screen, and it carries the bit of information that the cup has coffee in it. That's some information it carries. It carries additional information. For instance, it carries the information that the cup has a liquid in it, that the cup has a beverage in it. There's lots of additional information it carries, but all of that information is either nested either by a matter of logic or a matter of the laws of nature in the information that the cup has coffee in it. So you could say that the information that the cup has coffee in it is the most specific information carried by those words on the screen. It's a way to think about this. Now, the image on the right also carries the information that the cup has coffee in it. And it also carries the information that the cup has a beverage in it. That's nested analytically in the information that the cup has coffee in it, because coffee is a beverage, right? But in addition to that, it carries information that's not analytically or normically nested in the information that the cup has coffee in it. It carries the information that the cup has a cappuccino in it, that it's what we call an artisan cappuccino because it's got art on it, the heart or the flower, that it's got cocoa, that it's in a white cup, that the cup is on a table, that it's viewed from above, and so on. So there's a lot of more specific information that's not analytically nested and not nomically nested, not nested by a law of nature in the information that the cup has coffee in it. So this means that the picture carries the information that the cup has coffee in it in analog form, because it carries a lot more specific information in addition. Both representations carry the information that the cup has coffee in it, but the one on the left carries that information in digital form. The one on the right carries the information in analog form. Every representation carries information in digital form. So they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. If you had 1,000 words to describe the picture on the right, that would be the information carried in digital form. Right? That would be the most specific information. And you had a description, a long sentence, that would be equivalent to the information in the image on the right. So both carry information in digital form. All signals carry some information in digital form. The point is that the inscription and the image carry the information that the cup has coffee in it in different ways. One by nesting and the other not by nesting contingently. One by contingent nesting, the other not. That's the idea. So if we go back to our picture about how the senses work, you have the world, you have sensory transducers picking up on physical magnitudes in the world, you form a sensory representation, and then a belief. Well, we could say that sensory experiences are not experiences just that represent sensory qualities. That's too narrow. And it's not that they represent anything they carry information about. That's way too broad. We can have a middle view. The middle view is that they are states of mind that encode information from the senses in analog form, in a particular form, where it's important that the information be encoded that way. This is Dretske's idea. The senses are really important because they give us information encoded in a way that can be extracted to make a lot of different judgments. so encoded in analog form for delivery to higher order cognition in digitized form. So here's a new expression of the experience thesis, kind of prompted by the work that was presented this morning, implicit multimodal aesthetic experience. We could say that aesthetic properties are characteristically represented in states of mind that encode information in analog form, nested in the properties that realize them, so not nested in the words of the critic, but nested in the lemoniness, the toastiness, the colors of the sky and the ground and the sun, the movements of the dancers, also in the actions of the artist who made the brushstroke for delivery to judgment in digitized form. So if you remember the challenge, it looked like that. I thought that this reasoning was mistaken because the first premise in this little argument is false. And that means we have no reason to believe 3, which means we don't have to worry that artist gestures aren't represented in sensory experiences of paintings. We could say they may not be explicitly represented, but they're implicitly represented still in sensory experiences because they nest aesthetic information. So the aesthetic properties they determine are represented, could be represented in sensory experiences. So just the examples, you've got the balance of the wine. It's represented in a taste experience by representing the properties that realize it, the lemoniness and the tastiness. The lemoniness and the tastiness nest the balance, contingently nest the balance. This fits very nicely with the commonly accepted doctrine in aesthetics, that there are no laws that get us from the non-aesthetic to the aesthetic. That's why there are no recipe books for making aesthetically successful items. Well, so I didn't mean to do that. In the case of the Syrah, you might say it's calm, and it's calm because of partly because of your perception of the way that it was made by the artist. And you might say something similar about the Chinese painting. I haven't given you any argument to show that the experience thesis is true. My ambition has been much more modest than that. The experience thesis is quite controversial, but the thing is that we don't really have in philosophy a good grip of what we're trying to explain by appealing to the experience thesis. So I haven't given you an argument for it yet. All I've tried to do is establish that there's a way of reading the experiential thesis that's broad enough to include the kinds of access to motor routines on the part of artists that we heard about this morning. If you want to know whether the experience thesis is true, here are a couple of questions. You could ask, does the fact that aesthetic experiences carry information aesthetic information in analog form suit them to their role in aesthetic appreciation as inputs to aesthetic judgment and assertion? Or we could think of it this way. We can imagine different subjects. Some of them taste the wine. Some of them just hear about the balance of the wine. Would we expect that there be a difference in performance among these subjects? And would the experience thesis explain the details of that difference in performance? So this is just the beginnings of how you could think about arguing for the experiential thesis. And if this is right, then Stéphanie said this morning and David talked about this, she said that perception of artist gestures causally contributes to aesthetic response. Well, if this is right, then there's a reason to think that it's more than a causal contribution. It's a constitutive contribution to the aesthetic response. The aesthetic response consists in a liking, but also a picking up on the property that's a reason for the liking. And the picking up on the property that's a reason for the liking is nested. That whole apprehension is nested in the apprehension of the non-aesthetic properties that are responsible for that reason. Okay, so I think that's the end of my suggestions for today. Thanks. Looking forward to your